Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Getty Museum Art Break, Astrology Goes Online. I'm Larisa Grollemond, Associate Curator of Manuscripts here at the Getty Museum, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to this conversation today with astrologers Gina Piccolo and Kyle Thomas. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. And please use the Q&A box to ask questions. There's going to be time for questions throughout the program and especially at the end of the conversation. So if you do have questions, please pop those into the Q&A box for me and for the two speakers. So this conversation complements an exhibition that's currently on view at the Getty Center through January 5th. So you still have plenty of time to see it if you're here in LA or plan to be in LA in the next couple of months. It's called Rising Signs, the Medieval Science of Astrology. And just by way of introduction, this exhibition looks at the practice of medieval astrology through the visual culture of the 12 zodiac signs. And yes, these are the exact same ones with which you might be familiar today. And they were part of a scientific worldview of a pre-modern culture just as interested in figuring out exactly what the universe had in store as we are today. Astrology was a serious business, a scientific pursuit that went hand in hand with what we might differentiate as astronomy in the Middle Ages, and it helped to guide all sorts of aspects of daily life. The 12 signs of the zodiac were frequently represented in medieval art and with symbols derived from the series of constellations in the ecliptic, the annual path of the sun across the sky, as seen from an earthly perspective, of course. Images of the zodiac appeared in texts ranging from scientific treatises like those at left to prayer books, really beautiful 15th century examples of calendar pages at the center, structuring the understanding of the passage of time as well as providing clues about the future. Medical treatment and outcomes were one of the most pressing uses of astrological interpretation, relying on birth sign in conjunction with a variety of other factors, including the time of year, position of other major celestial bodies, and some additional factors as well. Here at the right are a 13th century rendition of the spheres of life and death, a divination practice using astrological information that would predict the course of a patient's illness. And visitors to the in-gallery presentation of Rising Signs will encounter the practice specifically of medieval astrology, some aspects of which might feel a little foreign, particularly how zodiac signs were thought to rule over certain parts of the body, causing particular astrologically influenced ailments, as well as personal temperament influenced by the balance of four main fluids called humors in the body. Today, though, the focus of our conversation is about astrology today. If you've ever checked your horoscope, have been personally victimized by Mercury retrograde, or shared a Scorpio meme on your Instagram story, you've engaged in a little bit of astrological thinking yourself. There's no doubt that astrology has gone fully digital along with so many other aspects of our lives. And my question today primarily is how do we do astrology in the year 2024, especially online and in social media spaces? And how is it different or similar than how medieval Europeans might have done it? I think a medieval person would have loved Instagram, but that's maybe a question for the rest of the program. So to help me answer some of these questions, we have two real life astrologers with us today. Um, and they are Gina Piccolo and Kyle Thomas. So Gina Piccolo is a counseling astrologer based in Nashville, whose research has appeared in the Mountain Astrologer and the Evolving Astrologer magazines. She's the president and founder of the Nashville Astrology Club and house astrologer and monthly lecturer at SoHo House Nashville. Welcome, Gina.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And also with us is Kyle Thomas, the resident astrologer for People Magazine and Good Morning America. He's a globally recognized pop culture astrologer who's been featured on Access Hollywood, Cosmopolitan Magazine, Entertainment Weekly, The New York Post, and more. His work harnesses the power of the stars in regard to entertainment, lifestyle, and trends affecting people worldwide. Welcome, Kyle.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly an honor.
I'm so excited to have you both here. So I want to dive right into the conversation with a question for Gina. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got your start in astrology and what has your experience of the practice been as you've moved more online, especially in the last few years?
Yeah, so I actually started way back in the 90s, before there were so many online opportunities to check horoscopes. I was actually a journalist at the time, and I was researching an article on what was called the New Age movement. And I was so struck by the astrology reading and the astrologer who pinpointed this very pivotal personal experience that I'd had in childhood that I was like, I gotta figure this out. But I spent the next 25 years as a journalist and kind of practicing in secret. But the more that the internet became a thing and the more information that was available online, the more I gravitated toward astrology and eventually got my certifications through an online college called Kepler College. And then during the pandemic, my practice really kind of took off because so many people were at home and needed guidance in a situation that made no sense. And so they were willing to give astrology a try. So
Hmm.
that's kind of how I got there.
Cool. Um, I mean, that's so fascinating because I think the explosion of online astrology has really been such a factor of our lives for the last, I don't know, probably 5 to 10 years. But so fascinating to hear that the pandemic was really a precipitating factor for so many people who are really looking for answers in a way. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, and so for Kyle, do you think that kind of explosion in interest and interaction, especially with online astrology, is generational? And do you notice a difference in the way that people of different generations are attracted to or kind of interacting with astrology?
Certainly. I mean, at the base of where we are as human beings, we all want to know where we fit into the cosmos and our purpose in life and what makes us special and unique. But I do think younger generations certainly are having more of an ownership of it at this point in time because not only is it much more accessible because of the internet, and there's been also a secular movement to sort of step away from religion in a sense from some people to sort of find answers when there's so much uncertainty, particularly with the pandemic and where the future is headed. So I certainly feel like millennials are really diving into that, further younger generations. And one thing I wanted to point out too is that the millennial generation is the Pluto in Scorpio generation, which brings a lot of attention to the esoteric and really claiming that and digging into the shadows and digging into the depths of what makes us human. And so as a generation, we also exhibit that, embody that, and hunger for that as well. But
Mhm.
I work with people, across, all sorts of generations. So I still think that there is this hunger to understand that connection to the divine or to the cosmos or other people, but certainly younger generations are hungering for it, I think, even more than anyone else.
Hmm. And what have you both noticed about like the demographics of people that you are interacting with online, especially like who wants to be informed by astrology and sort of who is using astrology in the most intense way, let's say.
I want to piggyback on what Kyle was saying. I mean, because when I started, it was mostly boomers who were the astrologers, and Gen Xers were very difficult. It was very hard to convince them that this was worth paying attention to. So it does definitely my clients. I have some Gen X clients, but I would say the majority are millennials. And now I'm starting to see Gen Z.
Mhm.
And
Totally.
I have a 18-year-old daughter who, for them, this is like a no-brainer. It's built into their apps. They meet people knowing their big three, their sun, moon, rising, and it doesn't require any explanation, justification at all. It's just kind of like, I get it. Next, let's dig in.
Totally.
Mhm.
Well, I think part of that too is that, when someone is drawn to astrology, regardless of their age or, socioeconomic status or anything of that nature, there is this hunger to know about the self and find that community. and we can learn a lot about who we are, but also about our that girlfriend or that boyfriend or our parents and how we relate. And that's one of the things that I think is so exciting for people when they are drawn to astrology, in especially online now, is they want to know about their compatibility, or they want to know what's going to happen or how this may play out, because it gives them an empowering stance on how they can create their destiny in a way that is working with fate, but also gives them that power to to truly embrace the authenticity of who they are. So I think that that's really important too.
I want to follow up on something Gina said about people just knowing things or sort of having it be a kind of basic personal thing that you either advertise about yourself or you kind of use as a mode of personal identity when you're talking to other people too, especially. Do you notice or have you noticed a difference in the kind of general level of knowledge that people come to you with astrologically, especially younger generations, maybe for whom this is a given?
100%. I mean, I was reflecting on when I started in 2014, which is not that long ago, and having most of my presentations in person be educational. Like, this is what astrology is, these are the planets, this is what they mean. And that is just not necessary. Now when I do talks, I'm like diving like into intermediate territory right off the bat because so many people have been educated by Instagram, TikTok. People have TikTok astrologers that they are, that to me is the most striking thing is the level of sophistication that the average person has now about astrology. And I think that has been actually great for astrology in general because it's really forced us to stop using these like go-to descriptions of signs and aspects and be much more nuanced and sophisticated and kind of go deeper, because everybody knows the surface level now. Is that your experience, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, and one thing that I always say with astrology now is that it's an art form. And so, when you find a particular, modality or technique or astrologer or brand or anything of that nature that really resonates with you, you really, as an audience, grab onto that and want to also, immerse themselves in that idea or that mantra or vision of the world. And when as astrologers, it's not a science. It's not a scientific science as it may have been in the medieval times, but that's why I feel like it's so beautiful to really use that nuance and use life experience and use your intuition and in regards to the way that I work with it, I really try to bring it into pop culture. And so that's what I've been doing with TV and magazines and that's where so many people are even, being introduced to it. And then it allows them to do that research and to, go into that app or read those books or take a seminar to also, layer in what, makes the most sense from their perspective of life.
Mm-hmm. What's I think so fascinating, studying medieval astrology and then sort of also participating in online astrology on Instagram and sort of seeing it so much is that there's really something about like astrological thinking that I feel like really connects the medieval with today, and that it is so much a part of the way people are interacting with each other or trying to find information about themselves or compatibility even. What do you find that people are searching for when they come to you and they want a reading? Do they want information about themselves? Is it kind of like therapy, or are they looking for what in the Middle Ages would be called divination or sort of like future telling? Or what do you find that people are kind of most interested in getting from an astrological reading today?
Do you want to go
I
first? Yeah.
yeah, because I think I noticed, and you probably have too, Kyle, that that has changed and evolved over
Yeah.
time. Like I think that when I started, it was more for fun. Like, oh, look at this kooky thing. Let's do this. I used to have astrology parties, and people would love to just figure out all that stuff. And then during the pandemic, it definitely got much more serious, where people were losing jobs and marriages were falling
Mhm.
apart. And my sessions became much more therapeutic and more
Mhm.
about healing and finding meaning in this insane moment. And I feel like it's continued to be, for me anyway, more about finding meaning. I also think that has to do where millennials are in their personal growth cycle.
Yeah.
Like a lot of them are starting to have what we call the Uranus opposition, which is their midlife crisis. And so they are coming to astrology with a need for, like, my life is falling apart and I don't know what I want to do anymore. So since they're sort of driving this, that's kind of how I have noticed it in my practice.
Totally. I mean, I think another thing that I always say with astrology is that it's predictive, but it's productive. And so, I think at the base level of finding a horoscope and wanting to know about their life and where the transits and the progressions and the path that is laid before them in the coming year is a big part of my business. But also I'm working with people on manifestation. So actually taking the stars and taking that flow of energy, because at the base of astrology, it's the study and research of the flow of energy in a birth chart or on any day or in a relationship. Again, we're always seeing the strengths or the challenges or any of that information. And so again, when I'm working with clients, there is a very high level of sophistication because we're talking about their business deals, we're talking about their wedding. We're talking about, how they can actually use it strategically and in planning, as well as understanding if that they're trying to cultivate something like, when is love? When is my best time for love? Well, again, you can see that kind of insight by again looking at the planetary movements, but then what is also native in their chart.
Gina, do you have anything to add about sort of what people are finding? I mean, I think it's so fascinating, Kyle, what you just said about people using it to plan a wedding or kind of do really practical things in a way, because
Yeah.
that's so connective in a way to the way that medieval folks were thinking about astrology too. Like, is it a good time to harvest this particular crop? Is it a good time to
Totally.
bloodlet? Like this kind of like
Oh, yeah.
very day-to-day kind of things. And I'm sort of wondering what the contemporary equivalent of those things are. And in some ways, I think they're quite similar. Weddings, love, like these sort
Yeah.
of basic human things. But is there anything truly like really contemporary that people are using astrology to figure out or to guide their decisions on?
Well,
Yeah.
I've had, sorry.
No, you
Sorry.
go for it. Go.
I've had clients who want to rebrand, and like, what brand do I need to, strive for
Mhm.
to, magnetize the best, the ideal client, So I think that's one way we definitely in the modern world see it. But I think it's interesting, honestly, that the rise in popularity of ancient methods, so things like Hori astrology, which is very
Mhm.
much divination, things
Yeah.
like medieval medical astrology, these things have come back into fashion among young astrologers. So it's almost like full circle. Yes, we use it for, what colors should I make my brand based on the placement of Venus or whatever. But it's also something that I think we're humans and we still have the same needs. And so we're using this system in very much the same ways. We want to find partners, we want to be successful, we want to sell our house and make the most money. And we want to make sure that surgery is going to be on a good day, So it's interesting how it's similar too.
Mhm.
Totally. I mean, astrology was created to encompass all life. So
Mhm.
astrology is life. And when, people ask me, they're like, well, who's the ideal audience, for astrology? Well, everyone has a birthday. So everyone can relate to it in some capacity. So, by looking at, the life progression and the kinds of, cycles and patterns that we all go through, we can understand that there are certain things that are going to happen because it's the Saturn return or it's the Uranus opposition or any of these kinds of things. But we again can utilize it in a way to create the life that I believe we really are meant for, and that's why when I'm working with people, it's here to empower them and to show them that this is the path where your life is headed, but you can also take, you can maneuver in different ways, or you can try to, improve that contract, improve that business. Like when I'm working with, artists and musicians and pop stars and such, it's like we literally go through the entire plan of like, okay, they're releasing an EP. And then, this is when you should be doing the photo shoot, and this is when you should be releasing, the first single, and it applies to all different levels of business too. So, I mean, there are financial astrologers out there that specifically focus on that, and that's what I think is just so beautiful about the fact that it is an art form, and we can provide that service to hopefully to, ourselves, to other people, and really hopefully make the world a better place.
So, I mean, it's interesting to hear you guys both describe people coming to it for both macro level advice, like a big kind of personality, or even like these big questions about success and love and things that are kind of life encompassing, but then also really small things and sort of everyday things, or kind of more immediate decisions. And that is to me really consistent with the use and sort of practice of medieval astrology in particular, because it's so encompassing that way, that it addresses both these like very everyday issues as well as these bigger, even more strategic kind of questions. And you both have talked a little bit about your clients and kind of the audience for this. Is there anything that you've done to change your practice or to adjust for meeting audiences online, especially? And is there a difference in the way that you find you're interacting with people online, like via Instagram or social media, than maybe an in-person reading?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, my whole practice is basically online as a result of the pandemic. I went from doing mostly in person to everyone understanding how Zoom works, everyone having Zoom, and everyone kind of preferring that. And then what I've noticed just recently, I'd say in the last year, is that people are tired of Zoom and they want to meet in person. So that started to, it's kind of gone in this interesting way. I definitely think that people have shorter attention spans. So there's that, that way that a reading has to hit these high points. And this isn't every single person, but I feel like there's a feeling of there's more urgency that just continues to get more urgent the more that people have apps that they can turn to for every single literally minute of the day that will interpret the placement of the moon in their chart and get that from an app. It's almost like the interpersonal readings have changed. And for me, I think having a membership where people can go and every single week get their rising sign horoscope, that is something that is new. I mean, for my practice, where my clients and they're probably, you know, Gen X, millennial age mostly, are really hungry for that consistent input of astrology, which has changed really drastically, I think, in 5 years. Like having that much interest that they need to be checking in either with an app or with their favorite astrologer every single week. That's something I've noticed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that's a part of like building that community and that tribe. And I think as human beings, we always seek to find that tribe and use that to build our lives and build our paths. And when it comes to my brand in general, I mean, there's just so much different kinds of content that I'm doing because, there's the kind of content when people want to be entertained, and that's very pop culture and, pop stars and music and that's very like memification in certain ways. But there, horoscopes are super popular. I mean, that's probably the most popular thing that I do in my website, my membership, my, magazines and people, all sorts of power horoscopes and visual graphics and TikTok and all of that. But it's even advancing in TV. Like I've done TV, I'm working in TV, and that is also building it as well in the medium and in the media. And I think that, it's one of those things. Like Walter Mercado was an extremely successful a pop astrologer and was tremendously influential. And one thing that I've even seen, like it's like it's building in waves again, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going, through the cycles. And we can see that as astrologers why that is. I mean, there's activations of a lot of Aquarian energy, and Aquarius rules astrology, and the Great Conjunction happened there, and Pluto's in there, and so we have a lot of these kinds of zeitgeist social things that are influencing us. But I really do think it's going to continue to just get bigger and more interactive as the industry grows.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Kyle. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say Kyle made a great point about how it has changed in pop culture and how much more acceptable it has become in these mainstream
Yeah.
media that even 10 years ago you didn't necessarily see. Like, I mean, there was I can remember the date of the first New York Times piece that really like front and center took it seriously. And I think that, I think it's fascinating to watch that, having been inside the media and tried to write about those things in a time when it was just laughed at, and now it's so much more acceptable.
I think this is an interesting conversation thinking about medieval astrology in particular, because one of the most frequently asked questions I get is like, would an average medieval person know their sun sign, say, or like how engaged would they have been in kind of the daily practice of astrology? And it's hard to know because there are so many kind of levels of engagement. There's people who probably knew their sun sign or maybe knew their temperament, but then would have to consult professionals, would have to consult doctors, would have to consult astrologers or people who knew how to interpret those movements a little bit more particularly. And what I think is so fascinating about online astrology is that it's so much more open. People know so much more about it, that there's just a more engaged level of knowledge about the basics. And so you can sort of go from there. But there is, Kyle, as you were saying, this visual culture of astrology, which feels really present for people. And I think as an art historian, that's something I'm interested in because, of course, the show has visual culture relating to the zodiac, especially, and the kind of representation of the zodiac in a whole bunch of different kinds of medieval books and manuscripts, especially, that were seen by a whole bunch of different people, but generally more literate, more cultured, richer people. But with the kind of development of online astrology, there's a much more democratic kind of access to visual information. And I'm wondering if you both could reflect on the visual culture of contemporary astrology. And is it just memes, or sort of what does it look like? What do people expect from an astrology account on Instagram, say, or an app? Like, what does astrology look like on the internet? And how would you characterize it? I'm curious.
Do you want to go, Kyle?
Well, so I mean, there's again, it goes back to the different kinds of audiences that you're trying to connect with, and what their level of interest is, because there's certain people that are going to be very drawn to just the humorous aspects of it. So they expect something that's going to be very funny or sassy or very entertaining in that regard. So we do see, cartoons and, celebrities and funny meme moments that are very pop culture created in that kind of format. But again, I mean, I feel like there are plenty of accounts, like even mine included, where there's like, beautiful skies, skylines and or like, nature images, and then you've got like words and poetry and that creates a different dynamic as well. And that audience is going to look for that kind of reading essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of that, but there's, I'm going even to TikTok. I mean, there's just the camera, the face, there's a lot of different ways that, it's being, distributed, but kind of in the sense of like, with the proliferation of like, the manuscripts in the Middle Ages, and then, you know, proliferation of the printing press and technology, and now with the internet, again, there's a lot more out there because there's just so many content creators. But again, I think that's why, once people get their like taste, wet with it and excited about it, then they really start to find the nuance of like what resonates and how engaged they want to be, or if there's a particular astrologer or content creator that they really like, and what again is serving them as an individual in their
Mm-hmm.
day.
Mhm. Yeah, I would speak to the idea of point of view too. I think in one of the things that in every single facet of online culture, you have to have a point of view.
Mm.
You have to have some way of distinguishing yourself, whether it's your brand or the style of your
Mhm.
videos or the way that you deliver things. Are you like a news broadcaster? Or are you out in a field somewhere being like, very airy fairy? So I think that what's happened is, like in the late 60s and 70s, the last wave of astrology, pop astrology, we had the woman in a muumuu with, a lot of sparkly things on her. And
Yeah.
now there's such a broad range of astrologer, archetypes basically that you can be any kind of astrologer that you want to be, because that's the breadth of the internet, that's the breadth of the online culture. But I think you do have to pick. You do need to, in order to be break through, you do have to have a point of view so that people know where you land on the spectrum of the overwhelming number of astrology accounts there are out there
Yeah.
now.
I think this is one of those interesting things where people identify so much with their sign. It's so much a part of like personal identity that you both spoke about people like leading with it when they introduce themselves, or that's like you would almost introduce yourself with your sign after your job or something. It's like one of those fixed things. I think people are often surprised to know in the Middle Ages, signs were assigned to months, individual months. So your medieval sign might have been different than your contemporary sign. It has to do with the specificity of astronomical calculation, and it's much more sophisticated now than it was in the Middle Ages. But um, the way that people, I think, would identify with their sign was for medical reasons. And there is a real sort of sense of your sun sign being determinative of your temperament, which has to do more with medical treatment than personality. And I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the way that people are organizing their own kind of idea of self around these astrological concepts, and if you think that that's a recent move, or if that is something maybe that has always been there for you in your astrological practice.
I want to speak a little bit to Gen Z and what I'm starting to notice, and maybe it's because I'm a mom of a Gen Z person, but I'm noticing a little bit that's a little bit concerning is like over identifying with the
Mm-hmm.
sun sign, or over identifying with the sun moon rising to the point of, well, I'm not gonna go out. I don't go out with Aries. I don't date outside the fire signs or whatever it is. Like I'm just starting to notice a little bit of narrowing of that, being a little rigid in that area with that generation. But
Mm-hmm.
I think with other groups, I like that I'm noticing with the millennials, because they have much more sophisticated understanding, that they are less inclined to pigeonhole themselves, because they're starting to understand it's a whole chart. It's a much bigger identity. It's not you are this and that is all you are, so there's a much more way of looking at it with that's more holistic, I think. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think, well, it's fascinating because the primary use of astrology in the Middle Ages is really around medicine, especially as it relates to the sort of understanding of the self. And that's fascinating what you've said about sort of people maybe over identifying with their astrological sign, or sort of seeing that as a limiting factor. Kyle, has that been your experience also?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny when, I meet the client or I meet the individual and they're like, listing every single placement they have. And I'm like, okay, come on. Like I'm an astrologer and don't have time to sit there and do that unless this is a reading, like who should I be with if I have a Venus in Taurus? Like, and I'm like, it's so much more complicated than that, and to understand, you know, it's this is one thing that I'll see in so many different kinds of relationships, especially with, obviously with compatibility, is that you can have the most like ordained and divine connection and astrologically in compatibility. But sometimes when things are really easy, people don't work for them. And so it gets boring, or they don't, reach the actualization of the fulfillment of this relationship. However, just because someone is an incompatible sign doesn't mean that you can't be in that relationship with them. Because again, it's at the end of the day, astrology, does show us a tremendous amount about our lives, our personalities, our relationships, but we also have free will. So any relationship, regardless if it's the most compatible or least compatible, if you both want to work for it, you will make it work. And so that's why when I'm trying to like use the practicality of it and explain, okay, like you may be a Sagittarius sun, but you can still work with a Taurus sun, even though you're not as compatible. It's just it's looking at like the full beauty of what your relationship can be and who you can be, and really trying to play and lead into your strengths. I think that's one of the big things that I'm trying to work with people on.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting a little ways into the program here, so I want to open it up for people to ask questions. So if you have questions, you can pop them in the Q&A box. There's already a bunch here, so I will pick and choose some. We had a few questions about associate artful non-sciences. So tarot, runes, I Ching. Do you guys use any of that in your practice? And if so, how?
I personally do tarot for myself, but I don't mix and match. I usually just stick with the astrology, but I do weave in some psychological principles.
Mhm.
But yeah, I know a lot of astrologers have begun doing tarot, which I actually, as a client myself, love, but that's not something I feel comfortable doing.
Yeah, I do actually use tarot in specific readings. And the thing that I think is so beautiful about it is that's another form, like a lens that we can see to understand more information. Like let's say, someone's birth chart or their transits for the year, say like there's a ton of energy around love at this point in time. Well, if as we're pulling the tarot, a card of the individual pops up that shows like who the individual is going to be, then we have more information. So I do a lot of I certainly, add in the intuitive nature of that to it. And I did go to school for psychology, so I also add in that component too. So I'm always trying to bring the most practical but empowering um, techniques to the individual that are very specific to them and what they're looking for at that time.
Mm-hmm. And a few questions about using stars as they aligned in real time, or old charts that we grew up with that no longer align. And also kind of a related question. Could you say something about the supposed 13th astrological sign? Is that something astrologers talk about or discuss ever? Or is that something NASA made up?
I know astrologers talk about it. There's a lot of controversy
Mhm.
between whether, I mean, I personally don't use, is it Ophiuchus? I don't know how to pronounce that
Yeah.
13th sign. Because I use an ancient system that doesn't match up with the where everything is in the moment in the sky. So it is more of a seasonal, it's attached to the seasonal cycles rather than the location of the constellations. So I mean, I think it's interesting, but it's just not the astrology that I practice. So I am curious about it, but I'm not using it in practice.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, Western astrology, for the most part, really does tie to the season. So, we have everything, laid out by that. And, each of the zodiac signs is the same amount of days, et cetera. So we have that insight of the polarities in the changing seasons, at least in the way that I work with it. But there are a lot of other techniques that you can use. Like I believe Vedic astrology uses the actual sky as it is right now. So the dates have shifted.
Mhm.
And that's why I believe, I mean, I obviously, this is just generalization since I haven't studied it, but they do include that 13th sign there.
Mhm.
So is it something that I think that if people really resonate and they want to dive into, great. You have the full reign to do that, but that's again why you can find the techniques, you can find the ideas that really and philosophies that make the most sense to you.
Mhm. A few kind of different questions around the different factors involved in a reading and kind of how you put those factors together to do a reading for people. Some questions about how that would work in the Middle Ages. And just to answer those questions from a medieval perspective, you wouldn't necessarily have a personal reading in the same way that you have one today. Um, Basically your sun sign and even other natal placements would inform medical treatment more than individual personality. So I say that medieval astrology is more about finding the self in the whole, finding the self in a system of cosmic energy. Modern astrology is much more focused on the individual. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about what goes into doing a reading nowadays and what factors you take into account, especially when you're approaching a reading.
Well, I can talk to my practice. More and more, I like to use I don't even show the chart to the client, that I just speak to the person first and kind of get a sense of where they are and what it is that brings them to do a reading. Some clients, fewer and fewer, honestly, come once a year. Like my clients are more regulars who are charting either a crisis or challenge or a growth cycle. And so we're talking about things over the course of months and not just a once a year, what's going to happen to me kind of a reading. I do feel like for my practice, I see it moving more and more toward personal growth. And yes, building into those kinds of readings, specific dates where they can kind of count on specific kinds of energy to look for, to be available for. But I think one of the things that differentiates modern astrology from ancient is that we're not as black and white and kind of it's good or bad. There's a much more nuanced portrait of the things that an ancient astrologer would be like, well, you're going to die on this day. A modern astrologer would be like, let's wear our seatbelts and not run red lights, things like that. So there's a little bit more of a, yes, we can still do forecasting work. But in my practice, anyway, it's more of a little bit more nuanced because I think we're all so anxious all the time that I do think astrology can make people more anxious if we're not
Mhm.
careful. And so that I'm spending a lot more time, definitely since the pandemic, easing people's minds about things they've heard that mean really, really bad things. So they have just a tiny bit of knowledge and then they catastrophize. Um, I don't know about you, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like I'm trying to have people work with the flow of energy as it is being represented by the archetypes of the planets and the moon and the sun. But I do focus a lot on predictive techniques and looking at the transits and seeing what is likely to be the path that they're on. But then in that productive sense of if you know that if you plant your seeds at the right time, they're going to grow and blossom more abundantly if you do so at that period in time. But I mean, I do have, newbies that come to me that are totally wanna like their first reading or people that do come once a year and we really do focus on that. But then I literally work with politicians and business executives and pop stars that want a more nuanced reading as they were actually building out their plan in regards to significant goals or relationship matters. It's again very nuanced depending on their level of insight and their personal needs with the reading.
Mhm. Okay, we have, I think, one time for one more question. So I'll end with this one because I think it's probably a good one. So medieval manuscripts often show the signs of the zodiac with certain labors or agricultural events that are done at that time of the year, kind of part of how the signs of the zodiac structure time over the course of a year. Are there any modern equivalents, and what should we all be doing now in October, astrologically speaking?
Hmm. Well, this October is a little bit special because there's a lot of intensity with it. But generally speaking, and I'm sure Kyle would agree, this is like the harvest period where, seasonally we're headed into darker days and a more introspective time. I think if we're just talking about this October, it's a time to kind of breathe through any frustration and try not to push too hard because it's likely to maybe backfire because there's just a lot of intensity building in this month in particular. But I would love to hear Kyle's take on that.
Yeah, I mean, when we're looking at astrology, there are so many different archetypes, and we can understand that the zodiac signs, each represent different periods of the year and different attributes. And so as we're experiencing like each zodiac season, that on a collective level can open up particular energies for us. So, Libra season is technically a really good time for relationships, business or love or things of that nature. We did have an eclipse actually yesterday. And so that is a very powerful, significant activation of the Libra energy. And so we will be, on a collective level, again, looking more at how our relationships relate to our lives. And so that's why when, for me or for anyone who's making like a yearly horoscope, we talk about what those factors are looking like, what that planet represents, what it's doing in that zodiac sign, how we can again work with that energy because we can harness more in regards to what is being open to us and activated rather than trying to like bang down the door against something that's not going to be there. So that's why when we have like a full moon in Capricorn, like collectively it's good for ambition, or these kinds of archetypes can always be present.
Well, that's a good thing to keep in mind for the rest of October. So I would love to thank Gina and Kyle for talking with me today. It's been such a fascinating look at just how astrology works today, and especially online. So thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're wonderful, and this has been just a dream come true. So thank you.
And for those of you who are interested in other PST art programming, make sure that you sign up for this upcoming conversation with Charles Ross, Prismatic Effect, on Sunday, October 27th. And please make time to see Rising Signs, the medieval science of astrology, up at the Getty Center until January 5th. So thank you all for tuning in.